Husband ghosted his cheating wife after her one-night stand, a story of betrayal and revenge. Imagine waking up one morning, only to realize that everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and loyalty had been shattered. That's exactly what happened to Jack on the night of his wife's betrayal, a betrayal that would change his life forever. Jack is a devoted husband, a man who worked hard to keep his marriage alive. He wasn't perfect, but he loved his wife, Reth, more than anything. Their marriage had seen its fair share of struggles, arguments about small things, the pressure of work, and the ever-present challenge of keeping the spark alive after years together. But nothing prepared him for what happened that fateful night. It all started with an invitation to a party, just an ordinary event, or so Jack thought. Little did he know, this was no ordinary party. It was a key-swapping party. For those unfamiliar with the concept, it's a gathering where couples exchange keys, and for one night, experience what it's like to be with someone else. Reth convinced herself that this was harmless, a way to reignite passion, to feel desired by someone else, without really damaging her marriage. But as we'll soon see, some lines should never be crossed. When Jack finds out about Reth's one night with another man, something inside him breaks. He thought they had trust. He thought they had love. But now, all he felt was rage. This wasn't just about a mistake. It wasn't just about one night. It was about something deeper, something that shattered everything Jack believed in. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself. It was the lie behind it, the way Reth had justified it in her mind, the way she had treated their marriage as though it could be bent without ever breaking. But now Jack knew. It was broken. Jack had always believed in forgiveness. He had forgiven Reth for the little things, the forgotten anniversaries, the arguments that went too far. But this was different. It was a betrayal of trust that went to the very core of their relationship. At that moment, as he stood at the party hearing the whispers, seeing the looks, he knew there was no going back. And so Jack did what he thought was the only thing he could do. He left. Without a word, without a fight. He just turned and walked away, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost. He packed a bag, checked into a nearby motel, and sat alone in the dark, trying to make sense of it all. Jack couldn't stop replaying that moment in his head, Reth's face when he found out, the shock, the guilt. But no amount of pleading or apologies could undo the damage. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the sense of betrayal, the deep wound that now lay open between them. In the silence of that motel room, Jack came to a decision. He wasn't just going to walk away. He wasn't going to let her get away with it so easily. No, he was going to make sure that Reth, and everyone involved, felt the full weight of what they had done. Let's take a step back to where it all began. The party. It seemed innocent enough when Reth first brought it up to Jack. It was just supposed to be a fun night out, something different, something exciting, as she put it. Jack, always willing to make his wife happy, reluctantly agreed, though deep down he felt uneasy about the whole thing. There was something strange about the way Reth seemed so enthusiastic about the idea. Jack had never known her to be the adventurous type. Their relationship had been steady and predictable, but that was what Jack liked. Stability and certainty. But lately, Reth had been different. She seemed restless. Reth insisted it was just a night of fun. No harm, she said. Just a harmless game where couples swap keys for one night, spend time with someone else, and then go home as if nothing had changed. Jack didn't understand how that could be harmless, but he trusted Reth. They'd been together for years, built a life together. He couldn't imagine she'd ever do anything to hurt him. But the night of the party, something felt off from the moment they arrived. Jack walked into the room, holding Reth's hand, but there was a tension between them that he couldn't shake. The atmosphere was different than he expected. There were smiles, laughter, and music, but underneath it all, there was something else. A kind of nervous energy, as if everyone knew what was about to happen, and was just waiting for it to unfold. As the evening wore on, Jack kept glancing at Reth. She was smiling, laughing, and mingling with the other guests, but there was something about the way she was acting that made Jack uneasy. It wasn't just that she was enjoying herself. It was the way she seemed more alive, more excited than she had in months. Jack couldn't help but notice how she leaned in just a little too close when talking to Brian. Every laugh and every gesture seemed to draw her closer to him. It was subtle, but to Jack, it felt like a glaring sign. And then the moment came. It was time for the game. The couples gathered around, and one by one, they dropped their keys into a bowl. Jack's heart raced as he watched Reth take out her key and toss it in without a second thought. She didn't even look at him. She was too busy chatting with someone on the other side of the room. For a split second, Jack thought about pulling his key back, stopping the whole thing before it started, but something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of making a scene. Or maybe, deep down, he didn't want to believe that anything bad could really happen. The keys were mixed, and each person reached in to grab one. Jack watched as Reth's hand disappeared into the bowl and came out holding a key. His heart stopped. Who did it belong to? He watched her eyes scan the room, looking for the person who matched the key in her hand. And then it happened. She locked eyes with Brian, one of the men at the party, someone Jack barely knew. He watched as they exchanged a brief smile, something quiet and knowing passing between them. It felt like a punch to the gut. Jack didn't want to admit it at the time, but in that moment he knew something was going to go wrong. It was the way Reth looked at Brian, not with hesitation or awkwardness, but with a kind of ease, a familiarity that Jack didn't understand. The rest of the night was a blur. Jack tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at his insides, tried to enjoy himself, but every time he looked at Reth and Brian together, the unease grew. Jack spent the next few hours pretending everything was fine. He talked to other guests, and even forced a few laughs, but his mind kept drifting back to Reth and Brian. He could feel something slipping away, something he couldn't control. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just one night, just a stupid game that meant nothing, but deep down he knew better. Reth was different. He was different. And by the end of the night, everything would change. As the evening wore on, the tension only grew worse. Jack kept an eye on Reth, but she was laughing, joking, and talking with Brian more than anyone else. He tried to talk to her, tried to ask her if she was okay, but she brushed him off, telling him not to worry, that it was all just part of the fun. But Jack wasn't having fun. All he could think about was what was happening when he wasn't looking. And then, as the night came to a close, something snapped. Jack noticed that Reth and Brian had disappeared. He looked around the party, his heart pounding in his chest. She wasn't in the living room. She wasn't in the kitchen. Panic started to set in as he searched the house. Finally, he found them, in a bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Jack froze, staring at the door, unable to move, his worst fear playing out right in front of him. Through the crack in the door, he saw them, Reth and Brian, sitting too close, whispering, their hands brushing against each other. Jack's heart sank. It wasn't just about what they were doing. It was the betrayal, the trust that had been broken. Jack stood there for what felt like hours, his mind racing, his chest tight. He wanted to burst in, to pull Reth away, to scream at them both. But he couldn't. Instead, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding, his mind filled with anger, hurt, and confusion. Jack walked back into the living room, but it all felt like a dream, like none of it was real. Everything he thought he knew about Reth, about their marriage, seemed to crumble before his eyes. And in that moment, Jack knew nothing would ever be the same again. Jack had left the party that night feeling sick to his stomach. He couldn't shake the images from his mind. Reth and Brian sitting together, their hands almost touching, the whispers between them. He tried to tell himself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe he was overreacting, letting his jealousy get the best of him. But deep down, Jack knew better. Something had shifted that night. Jack hadn't gone home right after the party. He needed space-time to think. He wandered the streets, his mind swirling with thoughts of betrayal and disbelief. Hours passed, and the early morning sun began to peek through the horizon. Still, he didn't feel ready to face Reth. But eventually, Jack knew he had to go back. He couldn't avoid it forever. As he pulled into the driveway, a familiar dread washed over him. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a place full of lies. He walked in quietly, the house eerily still. The kitchen light was on, and Reth was sitting at the table, staring into her coffee cup. She looked up as Jack entered, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. "Jack," she began, her voice small, uncertain. "I didn't think you'd come back so soon." Jack stood there for a moment, staring at her. The words wouldn't come. He wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but all he could feel was a deep, aching pain in his chest. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Reth didn't respond right away. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the right words. Jack watched as she fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding his gaze. I don't know, Jack," she finally said, her voice trembling. "It was just a stupid party. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything," Jack repeated, his voice louder now, the anger starting to rise. "You sat there with him, in that room, and you want to tell me it didn't mean anything?" He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the betrayal cutting deeper with each word she spoke. Reth looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. Jack wanted to believe her, to believe that it was all just a mistake, but he couldn't. Not after what he had seen. "I'm sorry, Jack," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I was thinking. I just felt lost. I didn't mean to hurt you." But her words felt hollow. The apology couldn't erase the image seared into Jack's mind, nor the pain that had settled deep inside him. Jack clenched his fists, trying to hold back the flood of emotions. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her understand just how much she had broken him. But instead, he turned and walked toward the front door. "I need to get out of here," he muttered under his breath. Reth stood up, her voice rising with panic. She rushed toward him, grabbing his arm, her tears now flowing freely. "Jack, please. Please don't go. We can talk about this. It was just one night, I swear. I don't even know why I did it." Her grip on his arm tightened, her voice desperate. Jack looked down at her, his heart breaking all over again. He pulled his arm away, his face filled with hurt and anger. "Just one night?" he repeated, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You think that makes it better? You think that makes it okay?" Reth stood there silent, her tears falling. Jack shook his head, stepping away from her. The silence between them was suffocating. Jack felt like he was drowning, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't control. "Everything we built, all those years, gone," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what? A moment? A stupid party?" Reth tried to speak, but Jack cut her off. "You've broken something, Reth," he said, his eyes filled with sadness. "I don't know if it can ever be fixed." Without another word, Jack opened the door and stepped outside. Reth called out to him, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. Not now. As Jack walked away from the house, the weight of everything crashed down on him. He had never felt so lost, so betrayed. The woman he thought he knew, the life he thought they had, it was all slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He kept walking, his feet carrying him aimlessly down the street. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't care. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in that house, not after what had happened. Jack had always believed that love could withstand anything. He had forgiven Reth for so many things over the years, small arguments, misunderstandings, even moments where they had grown apart. But this was different. This was a betrayal that cut too deep. Jack found himself at a park bench, sitting down, his thoughts swirling. He looked up at the sky, the cold night air biting at his skin. Everything felt surreal. Was this really his life? Was this really happening? Jack wasn't sure what hurt more, the act itself or the realization that Reth had been capable of it, that she could look him in the eyes and still lie, still pretend that what they had wasn't already broken. He closed his eyes, leaning back on the bench. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but more than the pain, it was the emptiness. The feeling that everything he had worked for, everything he had built with Reth, was gone. Just like that. Jack's emotional fallout. Jack didn't go far after leaving the house. He couldn't. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him like a heavy cloud, suffocating him. He needed space. He needed to think. Most of all, he needed to get away from Reth and the painful memories of what their life had become. Without much thought, Jack drove to a nearby motel. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place to escape for the night. He parked the car and sat there for a few minutes, staring blankly at the dashboard. The silence in the car felt heavy, as if it mirrored the silence now growing between him and Reth. Jack finally stepped out of the car, grabbed his overnight bag from the back seat, and checked in at the front desk. The clerk gave him a key without much conversation, and Jack was grateful for that. He wasn't in the mood to talk or explain why a man like him was checking into a motel at midnight. He just wanted to disappear. He opened the door to his room, flicked on the light, and let the door close behind him with a soft click. The room was small, just a bed, a TV, and a nightstand. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, but Jack didn't care. All he wanted was to be alone. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the night came crashing back to him. Reth's face, her tears, her pleading. The way she had said, it was just one night, as if that made it any better. Jack's chest tightened with the weight of it all. He had always thought of himself as a strong man, someone who could handle anything life threw his way. But this was different. This wasn't just some argument they could work through. This was a wound, deep and painful, and Jack wasn't sure it would ever heal. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. His mind raced, going over everything he had seen, everything Reth had said. He wanted to believe her, to believe that it really didn't mean anything. But how could it not? How could something so intimate, so personal, be brushed off like it was nothing? Jack had forgiven Reth for so many things over the years, things that seemed so small now. Forgotten anniversaries, heated arguments, even the times they'd grown distant because of work or stress. But this wasn't something he could just forgive and forget. It wasn't something he could ignore. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a hollow emptiness that no amount of time or distance could fill. He had spent years building a life with Reth, trusting her, loving her. And now, it all felt like a lie. Jack's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship, the laughter, the late nights spent talking about everything and nothing, the way Reth used to look at him like he was her whole world. When had that changed? When had he stopped being enough for her? Maybe it hadn't been a sudden shift. Maybe it had happened gradually, over time, little by little, until they both became strangers living under the same roof. But Jack had always believed they could find their way back to each other, that no matter how far apart they drifted, their love would pull them back together. But now, sitting in that motel room, Jack wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure if love was enough to fix this. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to see the dark, empty parking lot outside. The world felt so quiet, so still, but inside Jack's mind was anything but. He felt like he was spiraling, his thoughts chaotic and uncontrollable. For the first time in his life, Jack felt truly lost. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who could fix things, who could make everything right. But now he didn't even know where to begin. Jack paced the small room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Every time he tried to calm down, tried to think rationally, the image of Reth and Brian would flash in his mind, and the anger would rise all over again. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but what good would it do? The damage was already done. As the hours passed, Jack found himself consumed by thoughts of revenge. It wasn't something he had ever considered before, but now, the idea planted itself in his mind and refused to leave. He thought about what Reth had done, how she had broken their trust, and he wanted her to feel that same pain. Jack knew he wasn't the kind of man to act on impulse. He had always been measured, thoughtful, and someone who made decisions carefully. But this betrayal, this was different. It made him feel things he had never felt before: anger, bitterness, the overwhelming need to make things right, in the only way he could think of. He began to plan. It wasn't fully formed yet, just ideas floating around in his mind, but it was enough to keep him going, enough to keep him from sinking into the despair that threatened to pull him under. Jack stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. He looked tired and worn down, like someone who had been through hell. And in many ways he had, but he wasn't going to let Reth or anyone else see him broken. Not yet. Jack knew he couldn't stay in that motel room forever. He had to make a decision, had to figure out what his next move would be. But one thing was clear. Things were never going to be the same. The life he had built with Reth was over, and now, all that was left was the fallout. The plan for revenge. Jack lay awake in the motel bed that night, staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't let him rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Reth's face, her tears, her apologies. But no matter how much she said she was sorry, the pain still cut deep. The betrayal sat like a heavy weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Jack had never been the kind of man who thought about revenge. It wasn't in his nature to hurt others, to plot against someone, especially not someone he had loved for so many years. But as the hours dragged on, and the reality of what had happened sank in, something inside him shifted. The man he used to be, the loving, forgiving husband, was gone. All that was left now was the hurt, the anger, and the overwhelming need to make Reth understand the pain she had caused. For the first time since the party, Jack felt something other than sadness. He felt power, control. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't expected, but it gave him a sense of direction, something to focus on besides the emptiness that had been gnawing at him. Jack sat up in bed, his heart racing as his mind began to work through the details. He didn't want to do anything rash, didn't want to lose his composure and make things worse for himself. No, this had to be planned carefully. If he was going to make Reth pay for what she had done, he needed to do it in a way that would leave a lasting mark. A way she would never forget. He began by thinking about what mattered most to Reth. Their friends, their social circle, and the life they had built together over the years. She had always cared about appearances, about how people saw them as a couple. To the outside world, they were the perfect match, a strong, happy marriage. And that image was something Reth had worked hard to maintain. But Jack knew better now. He had seen behind the curtain, and he was going to pull it back for everyone else to see too. Jack grabbed his phone from the nightstand and started scrolling through his contacts. He wasn't sure where to start at first, but then a name popped up: Brian, the man Reth had chosen, the man she had been with that night. Jack's anger flared as he stared at the name on the screen. He could still see Brian's smug face at the party, laughing and chatting with Reth, as if nothing in the world could touch them. Jack tapped on the name, opening up Brian's profile. He wasn't planning to call him, not yet, anyway, but he needed information. He needed to know who Brian really was, who his wife was if he had one, and what his life looked like. Jack's fingers moved quickly as he searched for details, piecing together the puzzle of who Brian was outside of that one night. As it turned out, Brian wasn't just anyone. He had a wife, kids, a career, a life that looked just as polished on the outside as Jack and Reth had. And that's when Jack knew. Brian wasn't going to get off easy either. If Reth had destroyed their life, Jack was going to destroy Brian's. Over the next few days, Jack became consumed by his plan. He spent hours digging through social media, gathering information, and making notes. He kept everything organized in a notebook he had bought from a convenience store, the pages filled with details about Brian's wife, his work, and his connections. Jack knew he had to be careful. He didn't want this to come back on him, but he wanted Brian, and everyone else involved in that party, to feel the full weight of their choices. Every night, Jack would return to the motel, sit on the bed, and review his plan. He knew it had to be perfect. He wasn't just going to confront Brian and Reth. No, this had to be bigger. It had to ripple through their lives the way their betrayal had rippled through his. Jack started making calls, reaching out to people who knew Brian, his colleagues, acquaintances, and even his wife's friends. He wasn't aggressive or suspicious. He just asked casual questions, planting seeds of doubt, quietly spreading the truth about what had happened. It didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading. Jack could see the impact almost immediately. Ryan's wife started asking questions. Friends began to distance themselves from Reth. Their perfect social circle was starting to crumble, and Jack took a cold satisfaction in watching it all fall apart. But it wasn't enough. Jack wanted more. He needed to make sure that everyone involved in the party, the people who had watched it all happen, who had participated without a second thought, felt the consequences of their actions. He wasn't going to let anyone walk away unscathed. Jack's next move was legal. He contacted a lawyer, someone he knew from work, to start gathering evidence. He didn't know if he wanted a divorce yet, but he knew he needed to protect himself. The lawyer helped him document everything, the messages, the conversations, the photos. Jack wasn't going to leave anything to chance. If this turned into a legal battle, he wanted to make sure he had the upper hand. At night, Jack would sit in his motel room, going over every detail of his plan. He knew he couldn't act too quickly. He needed everything to line up perfectly before he made his final move. But the pieces were starting to come together, and with each passing day, Jack's determination grew stronger. Revenge wasn't something Jack had ever thought he was capable of. But now it was the only thing that made sense. Reth and Brian had destroyed his life, and now it was time for him to destroy theirs. The fallout begins. Jack hadn't expected things to happen so quickly. He thought it would take time for his plan to take effect, but in just a few days, the cracks were already showing. The carefully crafted lives that Reth and Brian had built, the ones they had worked so hard to protect, were beginning to crumble. It started with whispers, quiet conversations among their friends, the kind of talk that spreads fast when people catch wind of something juicy. Jack didn't have to lift a finger to push things forward. People were already starting to put the pieces together on their own. The calls he had made, the questions he had planted, had done their job. And now, it was out of his hands. Reth was the first to feel the fallout. The friends who used to flock to her, who admired her for being part of a perfect couple, were suddenly distant. She noticed it in the little things, messages left unanswered, invitations that never came. She tried to brush it off at first, telling herself it was just a coincidence. But as the days went by, it became clear that something had changed. Her once tightly knit circle was starting to unravel. Reth didn't understand what was happening. She had hoped that after Jack left the house that night, things would cool down, that they could talk it through. She never imagined the consequences would reach beyond their marriage. But now she was beginning to see the truth. The cracks weren't just in her relationship. They were spreading through her entire life. Jack, on the other hand, watched from a distance. He had moved out of their home, staying in the motel while he figured out his next steps. He wasn't ready to face Reth just yet, not while everything was still raw. But that didn't mean he wasn't paying attention. Through the whispers and rumors, Jack could see how things were starting to fall apart for her, and a part of him took cold satisfaction in it. Jack knew it wasn't over yet, but seeing the first signs of the fallout gave him the reassurance he needed. His plan was working. He had always been patient and methodical. This was no different. The damage wasn't done yet, but it was beginning. Then there was Brian, the man who had stood between Jack and Reth, who had been part of the betrayal that tore Jack's life apart. Brian's life on the surface seemed unaffected at first. He went to work, went home to his family, and carried on as if nothing had changed. But Jack knew better. He had planted the seeds of doubt, and now they were starting to take root. It wasn't long before Brian's wife started asking questions. Innocent at first, casual remarks about his late nights, about the new people he had been spending time with. But as Jack knew, those little questions would grow. They would become suspicions, doubts that she wouldn't be able to ignore. Jack had done his research. He knew that Brian's wife wasn't the type to let things go easily. She was smart and perceptive. Once the idea of betrayal entered her mind, it wouldn't leave until she got the truth. And sure enough, the rumors that Jack had subtly fed into their lives began to take their toll. It started with arguments, late-night fights that Brian tried to brush off. But the more he tried to downplay it, the more his wife pushed. She wasn't going to accept vague answers or half-truths. She wanted to know exactly what had happened at that party, and why Brian had been acting so strangely since. Ryan's life, much like Reth's, was beginning to crumble. The trust between him and his wife, once strong and unshakable, was now hanging by a thread, and Jack could see it happening, piece by piece. Every small victory gave him a sense of control that he hadn't felt since the night of the party. The balance of power was shifting, and Jack was no longer the victim. Reth, in the meantime, was struggling to keep up appearances. She didn't know the full extent of Jack's plan yet, but she could feel it all around her. Her friends weren't the same. People she thought she could trust were suddenly distant and cold. She tried to reach out to them, But the conversations were short and uncomfortable. It was clear that the rumors had reached them, and Reth was left to deal with the fallout alone. She still hadn't heard much from Jack. He had barely spoken to her since the night he left, and every day that passed without hearing from him felt like a punishment. She was living in limbo, not knowing where they stood, or if there was even a chance to fix what had been broken. Jack wasn't ready to confront Reth yet. He still needed time. Time to figure out how he felt and what he wanted. But he wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. Not after what she had done. The people around them, Brian, their friends, had all played a part in this, whether they realized it or not. And Jack was going to make sure that they all faced the consequences. Jack's plan wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. He had lost so much, his trust, his marriage, his sense of security. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was taking it back. And as the days passed and the fallout grew, Jack felt a small sense of justice. It wasn't enough to heal the pain, but it was a start. Reth's response and emotional breakdown. Reth had never felt so alone. The life she had worked so hard to build was slipping through her fingers. And no matter what she did, she couldn't seem to stop it. The friends who used to call her every day were now avoiding her. The people who once admired her, who saw her as part of a perfect couple, were keeping their distance. And Jack, he was still gone. She sat in their empty house, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Every time she looked around, she saw pieces of the life they had built together. The pictures on the wall, the souvenirs from vacations, the furniture they had picked out together. But now, all of it felt like a reminder of what she had destroyed. Reth had thought she could fix things. After Jack walked out that night, she had convinced herself that they just needed time. Once the anger faded, they would talk and work things out like they always had. But days had turned into weeks, and Jack was still keeping his distance. The longer he stayed away, the more Reth's hope began to fade. She had tried to call him and text him, but his responses were short and cold. There were no more late-night conversations, no more apologies from her that he was willing to hear. It was as if the Jack she had known, the man who had always been there, had disappeared. Reth was starting to realize that she had lost more than just her husband's trust. She had lost him, completely, and that realization hit her harder than anything else. She had always thought Jack would forgive her, that no matter what, they would find a way through it. But now, sitting alone in their house, Reth wasn't so sure anymore. One evening, after days of silence, Reth couldn't take it anymore. She needed to see him, to talk to him, to try to fix the mess she had made. With a heavy heart, she got into her car and drove to the motel where she knew Jack had been staying. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled into the parking lot. She sat there for a moment, staring at the neon sign of the motel, trying to find the courage to get out of the car. Reth knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. She had rehearsed it over and over in her mind, thinking of what she would say to make Jack understand how sorry she was, how much she regretted what had happened. But now, standing in front of the motel room door, all of those words seemed to disappear. She knocked, her heart racing in her chest. It took a few moments before Jack opened the door. When he did, the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to talk, but Reth wasn't ready to give up. She had to try. Jack didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, staring at her, his face unreadable. Reth could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything they had been through etched into his expression. But more than that, she saw the distance. The emotional gap between them seemed too wide to cross. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling. I just want to talk." Jack didn't respond. He stepped aside, letting her into the small, dimly lit room. Reth walked in slowly, her heart heavy as she looked around the space that had become Jack's refuge from her. "Please," she said, turning to face him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt you. It was a mistake, just one night. I don't even know why I did it." Reth's voice broke, tears filling her eyes. She could feel the emotions rising in her chest, the guilt, the shame, the regret. She had never wanted this, had never wanted to hurt Jack. But now, standing in front of him, she realized just how deep the wound she had caused truly was. Jack stood there, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look at her, didn't respond. Reth felt a wave of desperation wash over her. She had never seen him like this before, so distant, so cold. It was as if he had shut down completely, and she didn't know how to reach him. "Please, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't lose you. I can't lose us." She took a step closer, but Jack didn't move. He didn't react. The silence between them was suffocating. Reth felt her heart shatter as the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't something they could fix with apologies and promises. This was something bigger, something that had broken the foundation of their relationship. Reth sank down onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands as the tears finally came. She had tried to hold it together to be strong, but now, in the presence of Jack's silence, she couldn't keep it in anymore. The guilt, the regret, the overwhelming sadness. It all came crashing down at once. Jack watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with his own pain. He wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, anything, but all he felt was numb. He had cried all his tears. He had yelled and screamed in his mind, but now there was nothing left. Just emptiness. Reth, he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Reth looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her heart breaking all over again. She had known this conversation would be hard, but hearing those words from Jack was worse than anything she had imagined. Please, she whispered, just don't give up on us. Jack turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't have the strength to argue, to fight. He had spent weeks trying to figure out what he wanted, trying to understand if there was any way to move forward. But standing there, in that small motel room, he realized he didn't have an answer. Reth felt the last bit of hope slip away as Jack remained silent. The man who had always fought for their relationship, who had always believed in them, was gone. And in his place was someone she didn't recognize, someone who had been broken by her actions. Reth's heart ached as she stood up, wiping away her tears. She had lost him, and she knew it. The weight of that realization was more than she could bear. She walked to the door, her body trembling with the weight of her emotions. Before she left, she turned to look at Jack one last time, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. And as Reth walked out of the motel room, the door closing softly behind her, she knew that everything had changed. The life they had built, the love they had shared was gone, and there was no going back. Jack's final revenge and resolution. Jack had thought that once everything was in place, he would feel a sense of satisfaction. After weeks of planning, of carefully laying the groundwork, his final move was ready. And yet, as he sat alone in his motel room, staring at his phone, waiting for the news to break, he felt nothing. Jack had spent so long focused on his revenge, on making Reth and Brian pay for what they had done, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without the weight of anger and betrayal pressing down on him. Now, with everything set in motion, he didn't feel the relief he had expected. Instead, there was only a quiet emptiness. Jack's final act wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a public display of vengeance. He wasn't interested in making a scene. No, his plan was subtle, quiet, the kind of thing that would hit them where it hurt most, their reputations, their lives. And it had already begun. He had made sure that Brian's wife knew everything. The rumors that had started weeks ago had reached their breaking point. Brian's family, his work, and his entire social circle had been thrown into chaos. Jack had heard through the grapevine that Brian was going through a messy separation, his wife demanding answers and threatening to leave. The fallout was spreading, just as Jack had planned. And then there was Reth. Jack had been patient, watching from a distance as her life unraveled piece by piece. She had lost friends, connections, and the social status she had worked so hard to maintain. But even now, as her world fell apart, Jack couldn't find the satisfaction he had thought he would. Instead, all he felt was a deep, hollow sadness. Jack picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had one more message to send, one more piece of the puzzle to put into place. It was a message that would ensure that Reth, and everyone else, understood exactly what had happened. But as he sat there, his heart heavy, he began to wonder if any of it really mattered. Revenge had consumed him for weeks, pushing him forward and giving him a sense of purpose in the aftermath of the betrayal. But now, with the end in sight, Jack wasn't sure what came next. What would happen after the final message was sent? Would he feel peace? Would the weight on his chest finally lift? Or would he still be left with the same emptiness he had been carrying since the night of the party? He stared at the phone for a long time, his mind racing. He thought about the years he had spent with Reth, the love they had shared, the life they had built. It all seemed so far away now, like a distant memory. Revenge hadn't brought any of it back. It hadn't healed the wound that had been left behind. All it had done was deepen the distance between them until Jack wasn't sure there was anything left to salvage. Finally, Jack made his decision. He wasn't going to send the message. He wasn't going to push things any further. It wasn't that he had forgiven Reth or Brian, not by a long shot. But he had realized something in the quiet moments of sitting alone in that motel room. No amount of revenge could undo what had been done. No amount of planning, no amount of suffering on their part would take away the hurt he had felt. Jack stood up, walked over to the window, and pulled back the curtains. The sky outside was dark, the city quiet. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't relief exactly, but it was something. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight of this anger anymore. He had spent so long trying to control the situation, to make everyone feel the way he had felt. But now, standing there in the quiet of the night, Jack realized that the only thing he could control was himself. He couldn't undo the betrayal. He couldn't go back and fix what had been broken, but he could decide to let go. Jack closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. He wasn't sure what came next. The future was still uncertain, and the pain was still there. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. He had spent weeks planning his revenge, and now that it was over, he realized it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something new, something he wasn't sure he understood yet. Jack walked over to his suitcase, packing his few belongings. He wasn't going to stay in the motel anymore. It was time to move on. He didn't know where he was going, or what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the betrayal define the rest of his life. He zipped up the suitcase, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the motel room, closing the door behind him. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped into the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, Jack didn't feel the heavy weight of revenge pressing down on him. Instead, there was a lightness, a sense of something new waiting for him just beyond the horizon. Revenge had been a path Jack thought would lead him to peace. But as he stood there, looking out at the quiet city, he realized that peace wasn't something that could be found in the destruction of others. It was something he had to find within himself. And now, as he walked away from the motel, Jack knew he was finally ready to start looking. Epilogue. Reflecting on Jack's journey. Sometimes, life doesn't go the way we planned. We build our lives on trust, on love, believing that those things will always be enough. But as Jack learned, sometimes trust is broken, and sometimes love is tested in ways we never expected. Jack's journey wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about healing. And though the road was long and the pain deep, Jack finally realized that healing didn't come from hurting others. It came from letting go of the hurt inside himself. At the start, Jack believed that revenge would give him peace, that seeing Reth and Brian suffer the consequences of their actions would heal the wound they left behind. But in the end, he learned a hard truth. No amount of revenge can undo the past. No amount of suffering from others can take away the pain we carry inside. As Jack walked away from the motel that night, he wasn't just walking away from Reth or Brian. He was walking away from the anger, the bitterness, the need for control that had consumed him for so long. And in its place, he found something unexpected, a sense of peace. A peace that came not from the destruction of others, but from within himself.